Let's discuss the 1974 presidential address at the Mormon History Association annual conference delivered by a CES director that proved so controversial that the director was forced to issue a public apology and withdraw from public scholarship. I currently have the privilege of serving as the president of the Mormon History Association, which is why I have the cool seer stone to the right here, the presidential seer stone that's passed from one president to the other. And among my duties is organizing the annual conference. This year is going to take place the first weekend in June in Las Vegas. You should go register. It's going to be lots of fun. It'll be a gathering of over-specialized nerds, between 500 and 800 Mormon history nerds. You will love it if you enjoy this channel. So please go register and attend. And at that conference, I'll be delivering my presidential address. More on that topic in future videos. But I'd like to introduce you today to what I believe is probably the most controversial MHA presidential address delivered in the association's history. It was given by Reed C. Durham, director of the church's Institute for Religious Instruction in Salt Lake City. Here's a later picture of Durham because I can't find a picture from the era. In his presidential address, he spoke on the connections between Mormonism and Masonry, including the Temple endowment. And his remarks became a flashpoint for controversy, culminating in Durham stepping back from his public scholarship. So in this video, I'm going to set the context for 1970s Mormon history world and the Mormon history debates. I'll detail what Reed Durham how he was involved in that movement, as well as what he said at that MHA gathering. I'll then highlight the backlash and touch on some of the lasting legacies. And by the way, this is the first video in a series that I'm doing on the fights over Mormon history during the 1970s and 80s and culminating in the 90s. This coming Friday, I'm doing a video on B.H. Roberts' beliefs in the Book of Mormon and how that became a bludgeoning point in the Mormon history debates in the 1980s. And then next week, I'm doing a video on Mark Hoffman. Yes, you all have bullied me into doing that topic. It's probably the most requested topic covered, and I'm finally doing it. And then I'll be doing future videos on this topic as well, because the 1970s and 1980s fascinate me in how Latter-day Saints come to grips with its history and the rise of academic scholarship. Reed C. Durham Jr. was born in Long Beach, California. His father became a professor at Utah State University, and Durham would eventually receive his master's degree from USU and then a PhD in history from BYU. He then climbed the ranks of the church education system, CES, teaching seminary, institute, being associate director in Logan, all the way to eventually becoming the institute director for the church's institute in Salt Lake City, aligned with the University of Utah. In many ways, the most important position in CES education. He was also deeply involved in the founding of the Mormon History Association, which was founded in late 1965 by a group of academic historians gathered at the Pacific Coast branch of the American Historical Association. This new organization, representing a generation of Latter-day Saints wanting to use the tools of secular academia to investigate their faith's past, revolved around Leonard Arrington, who was a professor at Utah State University. That's where Reed Durham likely first met him. What comes to be known as New Mormon history, this new wave of scholarship, argued that we can break down these traditional myths and understand what actually happened back then. And there's lots of optimism early on that this history was going to be embraced by the Latter-day Saint community. And this approach seemed to triumph in 1972 when none other than Leonard Arrington was selected as the church's historian, taking on the position of church historian, a position that had only been held by ecclesiastical officers up until that point. In fact, Arrington was the first person with a PhD to hold that position. And Arrington tried to bring Reed Durham with him into the church historians division, though Durham chose to stay in church education. But Durham was assigned to write one of the volumes in the sesquicentennial series that Leonard Arrington envisioned to celebrate the church's 150th anniversary. There were going to be 16 volumes. I've done a whole video on this book series. Spoiler, it did not turn out well. But Durham was assigned to write the Crossing the Plains volume, or the pioneer story of moving out to Utah. He was also, and perhaps more prominently, assigned to be one of the co-authors of the one-volume history of the church that the History Division was going to produce to replace Joseph Fielding Smith's Essentials in Church History, what would eventually become Story of the Latter-day Saints, another really important book that I've done a whole video on in the past. You can go back and check it out. Reed Durham was deeply involved in these communities, not just in these writing projects with Arrington's History Division, but with MHA. He served on the executive board for MHA around 1970, and then in 1973, he was elected to be its next president, serving as president from the 1973 conference to the 1974 conference. And during his year, he's the one that oversaw the creation of the Journal of Mormon History, which remains today the premier academic venue focused on Mormon history. And part of his duties, as I mentioned before, was to deliver a presidential address at the conference that was taking place in Nauvoo. And he chose as his topic Mormonism and Masonry. So a few key points on this background. 1. Reed Durham was embedded within this new Mormon history movement. 2, he tried to keep these connections in these various fields, whether it be Arrington in the History Division, his bosses and employers in the church education system, but he also tried to reach out to the general public, which, number 3, the major point, he embodied this optimism of the era that we're going to be able to address controversial topics in ways that satisfy all sides, a reckoning that the community so desperately needed. Before I go much further, a reminder that if you enjoy this type of nerdy content, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. As I mentioned earlier, I'm starting a series on the battles over Mormon history in the late 20th century, of which this is just the first of many. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel. If you want to give back, you can become a member, which means getting early access to all of these videos. You also get little icons next to your name when you comment. But most importantly, you know you are allowing me and my producer, Anthony, to justify the time put into these various videos. So I'm very, very grateful for the many of you who have chosen to become members. I also recommend subscribing to my free kit newsletter, as well as following my different social media channels where I have supplemental videos that go alongside these larger videos. And all of this series of the Battles Over Mormon History is going to culminate in my next live video discussion. The first Wednesday of every month, I do a live discussion where I answer your questions. The next one is taking place April 1st, no April Fools, of reality, April 1st at 7 p.m. Mountain Time, where I will be doing a live Q&A on these battles over Mormon history. All right, let's get back to Reed Durham's address. Leonard Arrington, remember, the dean of this new Mormon history and the church's official historian starting in 1972, he kept voluminous diaries that I've spoken about in previous videos. And there's an ominous diary entry for March 19, 1974. It goes like this. Reed Durham was in the office this morning to see my Mormonism and Masonry file. It turned out that he has seen everything that is in my file. He is giving his presidential address to the Mormon History Association at Nauvoo on the subject of Mormons and Masonry. He says that the whole Kingdom of God concept, elaborated by Claus Hansen, that's a famous book of the era, is a Masonic concept that the flag of the Kingdom of God, about which Mike Quinn wrote his article, is a Masonic flag. He thinks a whole political Kingdom of God developed in Nauvoo in 1842 and 1843 and stems from Joseph Smith's Masonic associations. This would prove, like I said, to be an ominous entry. Now, the scholarship on Mormonism and Masonry was still in its nascent stage. You mostly found it in anti-Mormon materials like those produced by Gerald and Sandra Tanner. And some scholars knew about it, might mention it, but they didn't dig into it because they knew it was a bit sensitive. The church was very territorial over temple matters, which really dampened the field. So as Leonard Arrington's diary mentions, they expected, most historians knew that contents, but they also knew not to speak out on it. But Durham hoped that he could bridge those gaps and say that this is a new era. We should be able to address these questions. So the setting was the conference took place in Nauvoo. According to Arrington's notes, it was delivered in the old Nauvoo Hotel, which I'm guessing means what we now call the Riverside Mansion, formerly the Nauvoo House. Here's a photograph you probably toured in the past. While it was under control of the RLDS Church, then Communion of Christ, it was a conference venue and a sleeping quarters for reunions. And I've been very privileged to have several events there, and it's great. We also know from the notes that it was raining outside at the conference, so there was a bad portend just coming from the weather. And the address from Reed Durham was titled, "Is There No Help for the widow's sons, which many of you probably already have flags going up. That's a reference to Joseph Smith's alleged final cry before being shot in Carthage jail, which was a Masonic call of distress. And it sets the tone for his remarks. He dug into Masonic legends and traced Joseph Smith's exposure from them, from the pre-church period to the Kirtland Temple dedication to Nauvoo. He touches on Joseph Smith's use of and embrace of occultic artifacts, many of which had Masonic origins, as well as Masonic symbols that are found in temples and garments. He highlighted, for instance, the weather vane Moroni on the Nauvoo Temple. Here you can see in the William Weeks depictions. And he did not shy away from the connections to the temple endowment. Here are one of his more explosive remarks. There is absolutely no question in my mind that the Mormon ceremony, which came to be known as the endowment, introduced by Joseph Smith to the Mormon Masons initially, just a little over 1 month after he became a Mason, had an immediate inspiration from Masonry. This is not to suggest that no other source of inspiration could have been involved, but the similarities between the two ceremonies are so apparent and overwhelming that some dependent relationship cannot be denied. That gives you a sense of what he's saying. Now, this address was more bold than it was scholarly. It mostly converged bits and pieces that had been found in previous books and articles and anti-Mormon material. He drew from his students like Scott Kenny, as well as the work of Gerald and Sandra Tanner, whose anti-Mormon bookstore he had visited before. And he wasn't always careful in these comparisons. It's more of a collection of quotes and ideas and call for action rather than a particular argument. It is meant to be provocative, and he would later say that he was just trying to play devil's advocate to prompt scholars to spend more attention. And yes, more attention was definitely spent. Within a few days, Leonard Arrington wrote a letter to his children saying this about Durham's address. While what he said was not particularly new to us old hands in church history, it was new to some of those present at the meeting not familiar with church history, and was somewhat disturbing. I will be surprised if one of the persons present doesn't make some complaint to somebody about it. And that prediction soon to be prescient. There were reports very early on that the church's visitor center in Nauvoo even went out the next morning and removed the historic weather vane from display, the weather vane that was connected to Masonic robes that Durham had mentioned the night before. And very soon it became apparent that someone had made a audio copy, a recording of Durham's address that they then transformed into a transcript. And that typescript, that transcript of the remarks, was then passed around like wildfire without Durham's approval or even ability to correct and modify. It was spoken of in Gerald and Sandra Tanner's newspaper. Melvin Hogan, a Utah Mason, independently produced a copy of it. It appeared in an independent periodical, Mormon Miscellany, and then here's an example of a bound copy of it spreading. This is part of a very vibrant underground network of documents and transcripts being shared in the Mormon history community. And while Arrington, Durham, and others hoped the controversy would eventually go away and die out, it did not, and was soon going to require the church's official response. Remember, Reed Durham was employed by the church educational system. He was a director of their Salt Lake City Institute, aligned with the University of Utah. And once the discussion of his remarks became well known, and there's lots of discussion, and there were these unauthorized transcripts going around, the church forced him to make a statement. So here's a letter, what he called a letter of clarification, but it should also be seen as a letter of apology that he was forced to release to the community. It's long, but worth it. To whom it may concern, on Saturday, April 20th, 1974, at the Mormon History Association annual meeting in Nauvoo, Illinois, I delivered the presidential address entitled, "Is There No Help for the Widow's Son?" At the time, I was gravely concerned that the presentation of my findings and conclusions, a result of long months of research, would not be properly interpreted, and that, regardless of what I attempted to say, misunderstandings would occur. My concerns were justified. I have been informed of instances where even my own colleagues in the Mormon History Association, and also some close friends within the church, misinterpreted what I said, and more important to me, in some cases, even questioned my faith in Joseph Smith and the church. Of course, I assume the full responsibility for creating those questions, concerns, and misunderstandings. It was because I was not skillful enough, erudite enough, nor perhaps prayerful enough to make my personal position and feelings clearly known. Therefore, regardless of what I said, or what interpretations were placed upon what I said, let it be known at this time that 1. I know that Joe Smith was indeed a true prophet of God, the one called under the direction of Jesus Christ to usher in the dispensation of fullness of times. 2. I know further that temple work, with all its ramifications, including eternal marriage and the endowment ceremony, is divinely inspired. 3. Because of the personal witness I have received by the Spirit, which has been complemented and supported by continual study and experience, the prime criterion or standard of judgment I am committed to employ as an explanation of the aspect of the church, either of Joseph Smith and or the temple ceremonies, is that of divine revelation. Had I delivered my address in Nauvoo, making sure that my knowledge and conviction about these 3 statements was clearly reflected in the subject matter of my address, I am confident that the fewer misunderstandings would have been occasioned, and my address would have been more clearly approximated my honest feelings. I am deeply sorry that such was not the case. Sincerely, Reed C. Durham. That was, in a way, it did appease some church concerns, but it did not disappear those church concerns entirely. Arrington decided that it was necessary to remove Durham from the one-volume history. Remember that he was assigned to write with Glenn Leonard and James Allen that eventually became Story of the Latter-day Saints. They said that this was due to time commitment, but Arrington's diaries make it clear is because they knew that Durham was now seen as toxic within church employment, and they wanted this one-volume history to be well received. Spoiler alert, there were complications, as I noted in the previous video. And Arrington even noted in his diary that the history division is going to have to do more to distance themselves from Reed Durham because he was seen as so problematic in the church's terms. And in December, so months later, Arrington recorded in his diary once more one of these CES leaders who came and spoke to him. Here's an excerpt from the diary. He has received a good deal of criticism of Reed Durham's talk during the past 2 or 3 weeks. He asked me for my appraisal of it. I think he was trying to find out if we had read the talk in advance and approved it. I assured him we had not, and whether I thought it was sound historically. I told him we had serious reservations. He said the manner in which he presented this showed bad judgment on Reed's part, and it would, quote, put a millstone around his neck the rest of his life because certain of the younger general authorities will never be able to forget it. A few notes on that entry into Arrington's diary. I imagine one of the younger GAs that he had in mind was Boyd K. Packer, recently added to the Quorum of the 12 and already seen as a defender of orthodoxy. You'll also note how Arrington is doing all he can to distance the historical division, which is already coming under siege, from Reed Durham. And you'll also note the lasting consequences, knowing that this is not something, according to the CES administrator, that Durham would ever be able to get over. Now, Durham was able to take a year sabbatical, probably to get him out of the classroom for a bit, in order so that he can finish his one-volume history, which he never actually did, but as I discussed in the previous video, the sesquicentennial series never was published. But this was really a turning point in the Mormon history community. So let's talk about a few of the legacies that came out of this moment. We'll start with Reed Durham. Reed Durham remained in the CES the rest of his career, but he withdrew from the Mormon History Association, the association that he was so instrumental in helping to grow, and never worked in the scholarly community again. He would go on to teach the church education in Logan, Nauvoo, and even BYU, Hawaii. Here's an image from him delivering a devotional at BYU, Hawaii. And whenever asked, he reaffirmed his testimony and loyalty to the church. Whenever people approached him about this episode, it became clear that he pledged his fidelity to the church, and so that's what guided him the rest of his life. Mormonism and Masonry continued to be a controversial topic, but there were several important works ever since then. Just to highlight a few from the next couple decades, Michael Homer's article and dialogue, Similarity of Mormonism and Masonry, the relationship between Masonry and Mormonism, David Berger's article, The Development of the Mormon Temple Endowment Ceremony, published in 1987 in Dialogue, later transformed into a book, The Mysteries of Godliness, A History of Mormon Temple Worship. And then you had apologetic responses to all of these, like Matthew Brown's Of Your Own Selves Shall Men Rise, published in Farms. Notably, every single one of these new contributions begin with Reed Durham's talk, mentioning that it's almost like a necessary step for people to say something on the topic. They have to refer to that consequential 1974 MHA address in Nauvoo. That's how crucial that moment became in the broader Mormon history community. Thankfully, today, Mormon History Association has very little ties to the LDS Church itself, although we have a great working relationship with promotion and employees. And as you know from my various videos, I love the work being produced by the Church History Division. Heck, I have Joseph Papers Project volumes behind me. I think they are some of the best historians out there. And thankfully, the stakes, at least on the Masonry and Temple issue, is not as dire as it was before. In fact, one of the Gospel Topics essays that have come out in recent years, I believe it was in 2019, was on Mormonism and Masonry. And it includes basically all the material that Reed Durham got in trouble for back in the 1970s, which just goes to show how far the LDS Church has evolved in their relationship to understanding historical scholarship in general, but also Masonry and Mormonism in particular. So in conclusion, let's hope I don't cause as much of a stir with my MHA presidential address this summer. Because I'm not a CES director or church employed, that's probably not the case. But I promise you, you will want to come out to MHA because it's going to be a great address, or at least I promise I'm going to try to make address. But I think this episode remains to be important because it's a touchstone. It's a bookmark in this larger history. Very little of what Durham said in 1974 would be seen as controversial today. But it was so controversial back then. So we actually have him and others to thank for getting us to this point of a more honest reckoning with the past. It's a sign of how far we come. But it's also, we can't paper over how controversial it was in the moment to be able to understand the stakes of those historical fightings in the 1970s and 80s, which I'm going to be addressing in the coming videos. Make sure you are subscribed to this channel so you won't miss any of them. If you want to give back and support these videos, you can become a member. History has never been more relevant than it is today. And I think this saga is just an example of why history remains so important to the Latter-day Saint community in particular.